Good afternoon. My name is Tyler Sams. I'm one of the evangelists for the Judson Road Church of Christ in Longview, Texas. Thank you so much for being with me today. We'd like to continue our study in the book of Psalms. You may remember that last week we looked at the broad categories of the Psalms and how that can help us better understand this book. And today we want to look at the poetry of the book of Psalms and understanding the poetry and how understanding that can help us better understand the book of Psalms. But that leads us immediately to a source of confusion. When we talk about poetry, especially from an American perspective, we have a very specific view of what poetry is, or at least what we're expecting when we talk about poetry. If your upbringing was anything like mine, the kind of poetry you're familiar with involved Jack and Jill going up a hill or Humpty Dumpty having a great fall off of a wall. This American poetry based off of rhyme and meter. But when we come to Hebrew poetry, at least when we're told in the book of Psalms that this is poetry, that can immediately give us pause, and we might find ourselves frustrated because we're reading what we're told is poetry, but it doesn't sound like any poetry that we're familiar with. Well, that's true. We may not be familiar with it, but I would submit to you that it is poetry, and that it's poetry that is written in a specific way for a specific purpose, and in that specific purpose we find a blessing for our lives today. The kind of poetry that we're talking about when we're looking at the book of Psalms is parallelism. Parallelism is talked about in this unattributed article entitled Chimes, Times Poetic Parallelism, and the author had this to say: identifying parallelism in the Psalms helps us interpret the Psalms correctly. One thought can be clarified by another, either because it is a repeated idea, or because some other pattern of relationships provides the clue to an obscure meaning. This kind of poetry, parallelism, though it may not be based on rhyme or meter, does in fact have a very useful function. As the author notes, it can help us understand perhaps an obscure meaning, or it can clue us into what the subject is based upon these repeated ideas and concepts that we're seeing. Indeed, that is a hallmark of parallelism, and it's a hallmark of the poetry that we're seeing in the book of Psalms. So if you've got your Old Testaments with you, I invite you to open up to the 18th Psalm. That's where we'll be looking in just a few moments. Let's talk about what our goals are for today. Number one, we want to understand the methodology of Hebrew poetry. That's going to be parallelism. Secondly, we want to understand what parallelism involves. Easy for me to say, right? We want to understand what parallelism involves. That's going to include us getting a working definition of what parallelism is. We'll be able to do that rather quickly. We want to be able to recognize the three broad types of parallelism in the Psalms. And then finally, using this knowledge, we want to be able to apply it to help us better understand whatever particular psalm that we're reading. So let's talk very briefly about Hebrew poetry. We said Hebrew poetry typically focuses not on rhyme, not on meter, but more on parallelism. What is parallelism? Parallelism is the use of components within a sentence or a section of literature that are similar in grammar, structure, meter, meaning, or sound, and using these tools to convey a definition, a concept, or an idea to us. While we may not be familiar with the actual definition of parallelism, we are familiar, at least from an American perspective, with parallelism in general. For example, Neil Armstrong, when he lands on the moon, do you remember what he said? This is one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Or if you can think way back to literature class in high school, you might remember this opening line to a book. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. Maybe you see what I'm doing with my hands here. Do you see that when you're reading, that natural flow you get? It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. That's us picking up to this concept of parallelism, this poetry. It's not rhyme, it's not meter, but it is poetry. And it's something we find ourselves actually familiar with, even though we may not be familiar with it by that dictionary definition. We said there were three broad categories to this parallelism in the Psalms. Let's talk about that. If you're there in the 18th Psalm, look with me down to verse 5. Psalm 18 and verse 5. David writes and says, "The cords of Sheol surrounded me, the snares of death confronted me." The first category of parallelism in the Psalms that we see is what's called synonymous parallelism. It's the same thought being repeated twice but using different words. Same thought, repeated twice, but repeated using different words. Verse 5 again. The cords of Sheol surrounded me, the snares of death confronted me. We see this kind of language all throughout the Psalms. It's a form of poetry, it's a form of parallelism called synonymous parallelism. We're getting the same idea, but the same idea simply being expressed in different words. It's for a purpose. Secondly, we've got what is called antithetic parallelism or contrasting parallelism. Stay in the same psalm, Psalm 18, but this time come over to verse 27, Psalm 18 and verse 27. With antithetic parallelism, you have two lines contrasting each other for the purpose either of enlightenment or for emphasis. Psalm 18 and verse 27. You save an afflicted people, David says to God, you save an afflicted people, but haughty eyes you abase. Here's an afflicted people. Here are a haughty or a prideful people. Here are a people who are saved. Here are a people who are abased. Right? We've got two lines contrasting each other for the purpose of enlightenment or for the purpose of emphasis. That's antithetic parallelism or contrasting parallelism. And then if you come a little bit later, or earlier in the Psalms rather, if you look at Psalm 1, the very first Psalm, Psalm 1 and verse 2, we're going to see an example of this third category of the Psalms, or parallelism in the Psalms rather. That is synthetic parallelism. In Psalm 1 and verse 2, we have an example of synthetic parallelism where the second line develops or completes the first line. Psalm 1 verse 2, His delight is in the law of the Lord, and in His law He meditates day and night. Here's this parallelism. Here's how it all fits together. We've got somebody whose delight is in the law of the Lord. Now we're continuing that thought on law. In that law He meditates day and night. The second line developing or completing that idea from the first line, that synthetic parallelism. So three broad categories: synonymous, antithetic, and synthetic. There are a few other minor types of parallelism that you're going to see in the Psalms. For example, you've got emblematic parallelism, where one line presents as a simile the thought of another line. Stay in Psalm 1, look at verse 4. The wicked are not so, but they are like, here's our simile, remember like or as. The wicked are not so, but they are like chaff which the wind drives away. There's emblematic parallelism. One line presents as a simile the thought of the other line. You've got stair-like parallelism in the 29th Psalm, where part of the first line is repeated in the second line, but it's developed more fully. Psalm 29, verses 1 and 2. Ascribe to the Lord, O sons of the mighty. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory due His name. Worship the Lord in holy array. Ascribe to the Lord, ascribe to the Lord, ascribe to the Lord. This stair-like parallelism where the first part of the line is repeated in the second, but developed further. And then you've got something called chiastic parallelism, way at the end of the book of Psalms, in the 124th Psalm. Psalm 124, as you look, for example, at verse 7. Chiastic parallelism takes the form of ABBA, not ABBA, but ABBA, where you've got the first and the fourth lines corresponding, as do lines 2 and 3. So 1 and 4 are A, 2 and 3 are B, and they correspond like that. Look with me in Psalm 124 and verse 7. Our soul has escaped as a bird out of the snare of the trapper. The snare is broken and we have escaped. You've got at the beginning of verse 7 escape, and at the end of verse 7 you've got escape. In the middle you've got snare and snare. Chiastic parallelism. A, B, B, A, where the first and fourth lines correspond and the second and third lines correspond. What's the benefit of this kind of poetry? This poetry is generally accessible to any culture and any language. Look, if this was based on rhyme, English doesn't sound anything like Hebrew. How would you translate the Hebrew and maintain the rhyme? You really couldn't. Same thing with meter. But if you've got this parallelism, what we might sometimes call this thought poetry rather than sound poetry, we get something that is transferable across cultures and across languages. I think that's part of the wisdom of God in using this form of poetry. It's a poetry that's easily translatable. It's something we can relate to in different cultures, something we can take, we can use, we can digest and implement into our lives. So, reviewing. Hebrew poetry is more dependent on parallelism than on rhyme or meter. When we're talking about parallelism, we're talking about the use of similar components in a sentence or in a section to make a point. That's what's going on. We've got three broad types of parallelism in the Psalms: antithetic parallelism, synonymous parallelism, and synthetic parallelism. Antithetic, synonymous, synthetic, these three together are the big groups and categories of parallelism in the Psalms. And when we can start to identify them in the Psalms, that's really going to help us better understand the book as a whole and understand these individual Psalms. Thank you for being with me this afternoon. We'll continue our study next week on the Psalms. Have a great day.